Good morning. Very glad to see all of you here this morning. As you know, April at College Hill is our missions month. We've been saying it all month, but I'll say it again. We believe that our God is on the move. That the same God who was at work in Paul is working still today. And I hope that you've been seeing that if you've been with us these past few weeks. I mean, just think about the journey that we've been on together. And if you maybe haven't been here these past few weeks and you're here with us today, then maybe this can be a little bit of a recap. 3 weeks ago, we began to journey with Paul on his second missionary journey, and we began in a city called Troas, but we didn't stay there long because God was opening a door somewhere else, hundreds of miles away in an unexpected place. And so what does Paul do? But he drops everything and he goes. And we talked about how in our time, God is still opening doors in unexpected places. We talked about Eastern European Mission, whom we support, and the way that God has been opening doors for them throughout their history in Ukraine and Russia and in Eastern Europe. They're now sharing the gospel in schools, sharing the gospel to refugees, unlikely places. But God is moving. And God is opening doors, and we get to be a part of that. A God who's on the move. If you'd like to know more about Eastern European Mission, we still have some materials out in the foyer you can get on your way out. 2 weeks ago, we followed Paul again. We followed him to the city of Philippi. And you may remember that when Paul was in Philippi, he does something there that you just don't forget. He takes a beating that he didn't have to take. He shares the gospel by sharing his own life. He doesn't put himself higher than anybody else. He lowers himself. We talked about how in our time, there are Christians we support in a country called Malawi. 14 preachers come to mind who every Sunday morning, they've already done it today, get on a bicycle. And they carry the Bible and they carry the name of Jesus to villages across that country, sharing the gospel by sharing in the struggle, sharing their own lives, not putting themselves on a pedestal, but just as Paul did, carrying the name. God is on the move. Last week we followed Paul to Athens. We went up with him up on that hill called Mars Hill in that city of great culture, city of great intellect, and we talked about the way that Paul engages with a city of a forgotten God. We talked about how many places in our world today are like that. And we heard from some of our own here at College Hill, Matt and Lily Ryan, as they prepare to go to a place like that in Leipzig, Germany. You may remember that only 2% of people in that whole city believe in a God of any kind whatsoever. And yet God is on the move. And He's leading some of our own church family to step into that world and proclaim a forgotten God. Again, there's more information about their mission work in the foyer as well, including an email sheet that you can sign up and follow along in their journey, gaining support for their missions and also preparing to share the good news. I hope that you're seeing in all of this that God truly is on the move. Yes, then, in the pages of Scripture, but also today. And our story today continues in that yet again, although I must admit it's a little bit tougher one. In fact, this is not a story that you want to turn to if you're looking for quick fixes or three-step evangelism tactics or easy answers. This is not a story you're going to want to turn to if you're looking for a paint-by-the-numbers of how to win friends and influence people. In fact, you'd be better off turning to this story this morning if you want to know how to start a riot, because that's exactly what Paul does in this story. But even still, I think we see something fascinating in this story, and it comes from the very mouths of Paul's enemies, of Paul's opponents. And I want us to spend a little bit of time talking about what it says to us today. The place is a city called Thessalonica. It's the capital city of a region, Macedonia. We've been in this region past few weeks. We were there when Paul was in Philippi. Thessalonica is the capital of this main region in Greece. And we read in chapter 1 of Acts 17 that when Paul and Silas had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, the capital city where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Not surprising to find a synagogue there in a city so important as this one. And like we would expect of Paul, as we've seen him doing all throughout the book of Acts, first thing he does is he goes right into that synagogue, as was his custom. And on 3 Sabbath days, he argued with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This is the Messiah, Jesus, whom I proclaim to you." So for 3 straight Sabbaths, meaning 3 straight weeks, Paul has the floor in this synagogue. And he's preaching this little mini-series about Jesus. And he's saying, oh, by the way, this fellow that you may have heard about all the way here in Macedonia, the one who was killed as a criminal on the cross in Jerusalem, that's your king that you've been waiting for all of this time, and he's not dead anymore either. He's alive and well, and he is the only king that you ought to care about. Well, it's not surprising that that's kind of a tough sell for some people there. We're about to find that out. But still, there are some who were gathered there on those days in the synagogue who were persuaded. And they joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Jews and not a few of the leading women, Luke tells us. So people from different backgrounds, some of them prominent people, some of them Greek, some of them Jewish, are turning to God. They're hearing the message and they're listening. But before we get too excited, there's a problem. But the Jews became jealous, we read. And with the help of some ruffians in the marketplaces, they formed a mob and they set the city in an uproar. While they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them out to the assembly, they attacked Jason's house. They thought they would find Paul there. They didn't. When they couldn't find him there, they dragged Jason and some of the believers before the city authorities, shouting, "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also." And Jason has entertained them as guests. They are all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus. And when the people and the city officials heard it, they were disturbed. And after they had taken bail from Jason and the others, they let them go. Just like that, our story ends abruptly. Like I said, it's not your typical success story, at least not at first blush. Yet I think that if we look closely at this story, I think we learn something powerful about the message of Jesus and the power that it has to change lives. And as I mentioned earlier, our lesson this morning doesn't come from the mouth of Paul, but from the mouths of his opponents. I think when you read this passage, you ought to listen for 2 things. 1, what Paul's opponents say, and 2, what their actions say. So let's look at each of those. First, we look at what they say. Talking about Paul and Silas, they say this: these people who have been turning the world upside down. Now, isn't that the truth? When Paul and Silas come into a city like this one, and they clear their throats, and they speak Jesus into the lives of the people that are gathered there, they might as well be calling black white and down up in the minds of those who are hearing it. The message they proclaim is just taking what these people in Thessalonica believe and flipping it on its head. They say, the king you've been waiting for died, but he lives. He rules because he served everyone to the point of death. It's this peculiar message that turns everything around. And for those who would accept this message, they would need to do some turning around in their minds, some reorienting, some reorganizing of what they believe to be true what they hold to be most important, and the way they live their lives. We get a taste of this when we look to Paul's follow-up letter to these Christians in Thessalonica. He says things like this: if you're going to live in this upside-down world, which is really turning the world back right, if you're going to live in this upside-down world, you don't repay evil for evil as a follower of Jesus, but you always seek to do good to one another, and not just one another, to everyone. Imagine what that might be like. Paul says, in this upside-down world that Jesus creates, you give thanks, no matter the circumstances. Not just when it's good times, but even in the hard ones. Paul's saying, in this upside-down world, you bow down to a king, but it's not that king who hangs out in a palace in Rome. It's the king who hung on a cross in Jerusalem. What I'm saying is that to live as a Christian, as Paul is proclaiming it, is to make some serious changes, to undergo a true reorienting of our lives and our principles and our hearts and our minds. Paul's own enemies say as much. They say, these fellows, they're turning the world upside down when they preach about this Jesus. That's what they say with their words. Well, what do they say with their actions? With their actions, they say, we're not ready for that. We're not ready for this sort of change, this reorientation of our lives. They resist that change, and they hurt the ones who believe. We're not told exactly why. We are told there's a little bit of jealousy involved in it. That's the first thing and the one thing we're told, but maybe there's something else as well. Maybe when you've been looking for a Messiah for so long that's one way, it can be hard to fathom that he might be different than what you've been thinking all along, that he might suffer rather than kick out Rome and rule. But that's what Paul is saying this Messiah is all about. Maybe they're sort of stuck in an imaginative rut, not able to see outside this box that they've created for what they think the Messiah is going to be like, unable to fathom that a king could carry a cross. Maybe they're unwilling to go there. Or maybe they're just scared. We consider that. Maybe they're just scared to proclaim another king than the one who's in power in their world. That's what they say Paul is doing and Jason is doing. They say they're proclaiming another king named Jesus. That's dangerous business. When there's an emperor on the loose in Rome, maybe they're a little bit scared to say that this Jesus is in fact king. What is that going to do for our lives and our families and our businesses and our place in this world? Maybe they're afraid to end up like Jason, who's right there in front of them. Afraid to have their worlds turned upside down by Jesus. Whatever we may believe about their motives, we can be sure of one thing: Paul's opponents tell the story with their words and with their actions. They let us know that when you truly believe this message of Jesus, it changes everything. And guys, many centuries have passed since then, but that has not changed. Today, as much as ever, when you choose to reorient your life to a God who suffers, to a God who says, love your enemies and blessed are the poor in spirit, that's the kind of message that can turn your world upside down. Well, this is Missions Month. We're talking about the way that God is moving then and now, and today have the chance to share with you about a mission effort that's been close to College Hill's heart for quite some time, the work of Sunset International Bible Institute, as they have been, in the words of this story, turning the world upside down. Just this week, I got to talk to Chris Swinford. Many of you know him. He was in town a couple weeks ago, and I was telling him about our Missions Month series, and I just asked him, tell me a story about the way that God is using Sunset International Bible Institute to turn someone's world upside down. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was something like, you only want one? You can imagine Chris, if you know Chris, he didn't just give me one, but I'll tell you one this morning. Chris sent me this photo. In this photo, you'll see two Christian preachers who are in Cairo, Egypt. One of them named Francis, they're brothers, Francis and Alfred Habashi. The other two men in the picture we see also, moments before their baptism into Christ. Up until this point in these two men, their lives, they have identified as Muslims. But all that started to change when they began to come and sit at these tables in a refugee soup kitchen in Cairo, Egypt. Displaced, they found themselves there in that soup kitchen, sharing a meal. And it was there that Francis and his brother Alfred were telling them the news about this Jesus. And when they heard it, it turned their world upside down. I don't pretend to be an expert on these things, and I don't want to paint with a broad brush either, but I think it's safe to say that when you become a Christian, growing up as a Muslim, in a Muslim family, in a Muslim country, that's a big, big change. That's what it looks like to have your priorities and beliefs and what you hold to be true, to be truly reoriented, to be truly shifted. And that change may have consequences. Sometimes it may come at a cost. And yet, for these two men, when they're standing there on the precipice of this new beginning in their lives, they are willing to let Jesus turn their world upside down because they care that much about him now. They've heard him and they've seen him and they know what he's done for them. And it makes such a difference that they're willing to have God turn their world literally upside down. I think that's a story that's emblematic of the work that Sunset is trying to do around the world and in many countries around the globe. You've been a part of College Hill for very long. You know we've supported this work for decades, supported Chris as well. And it's a work that, at its best, God is using to turn the world upside down. One world flipped on its end at a time. Got to tell you, as I was thinking about that story, Francis and Alfred's story, and I was thinking about this story from the book of Acts, story of Paul, it's been challenging me to wonder, how is God using us, College Hill, to turn the world upside down? How is God using us here in this congregation to reorient lives and hearts to the shape that the cross brings to our world? Is he using us to do what Paul does in this story or what Francis and Alfred are doing in Cairo? Or is it maybe you and me sometimes whose worlds need a little bit of rearranging? Are we sometimes more, in fact, like those in the story who say, "Not so fast, Paul"? Could it be that we, like them sometimes, can too quickly limit God into our own categories, our own narrow imaginations, our box that we want to put Him in? Could it be that we need our own hearts and our own minds sometimes to be reordered? Could it be that sometimes, like them, we're just scared, just afraid to truly proclaim this Jesus for the King that He is, because sometimes that doesn't make life easy for us? Maybe it's you and me whose worlds need to be rocked a little bit, challenged a little bit in our own lives. Maybe we need to find a place for the true Messiah in our own hearts. I don't know. Those are tough questions. They're the kind of questions that start a riot in Thessalonica. Maybe they're the kind of questions that we need to have on our hearts. No matter what we say to those questions, though, I will say this, and this is what I'll say to close this morning. If we really want to be about what God is doing, turning the world upside down, reorienting this world to His grace and His message, if we want to be about that, then we do well to pay attention not just to our words, but to what our actions say as well. Because we need both. I think that a few more words of Paul's letter to the Thessalonians can be a good guide for us in this. This is what Paul says about his own ministry when he's talking to the Thessalonian Christians some years later, the ones who persevered. He says this, "So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, that is the message we speak, the words that we use. We're determined to share with you not just the gospel of God, but our own selves. That is, our own lives, our very actions. Because you have become so very dear to us." My hope is that we will learn to be a church that lives like that, and it's tough to do. But let's be the kind of church that cares so deeply about others that we show it, not just with our words, but with ourselves, by our very lives. And may we be looking for the ways that God is working in our world to turn this world upside down by the message of Jesus. I want to offer an invitation this morning, and I don't know how this story of Paul challenges you today. I don't know what place you might find yourself in this story. It could be that you're challenged to have the sort of resolve that Paul has, to bring that reorienting message, that really life-changing message to people in your life. To share not only the gospel of God, but to share your own self in order to make that change. Maybe today you relate more with those who said, "Not so fast, Paul. We're not quite ready to truly allow God to set the priorities, to truly turn ourselves over to that one true King." If that's where you are today, then maybe today God's challenging you to change your heart. Or maybe today you find yourself in the place of Jason, some of those others that were there on those Sabbath days and they heard the message that Paul preached. Maybe like those two fellows we met in Cairo, that when they saw what Jesus had done, it affected them so deeply that they willingly and gladly let that message turn their lives around, no matter the cost. If today you're ready to proclaim that Jesus in your life, maybe for the first time, we give that opportunity at this invitation. Or maybe today you simply just need prayers. or simply just need a moment to reflect in your heart about what God is challenging you to do and be in His name. Whatever the case may be, we have this moment now. While together we stand and while we sing.